Hey facilitators, Meg Bolger here from Facilitator Cards. I was running a session recently on facilitation, and there were a ton of questions from participants that we just didn't get to in the session. And so I thought I would take some time today to answer those questions, and that's what we're going to do. So this video is going to be 9 different questions that I got from participants recently. And I'm just going to share some of my thoughts and responses that come immediately to mind. And it's going to be a bunch of different questions and conversations about facilitation. If you want to jump to any particular question or see what all the questions are, you can check the notes below and jump to the ones that you're most interested in. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get into it. Okay. Why do you think being a good listener is important as a facilitator? So this was a question that came up in our meeting, and I thought it was a really fascinating conversation about why being a good listener is important as a facilitator. So I'll share some highlights from our conversation and then some of my own thoughts. One of the reasons that people said in the training that I did that it's important to be a good listener as a facilitator is because you are asking people to participate. You're inviting them to share with you and to share with the group. And if it's clear to your participants, or even if it's clear to them that you're not listening, or even if it is unclear that you are listening, it can discourage participation. When somebody asks for your thoughts, your opinions, your ideas, and then they just kind of move on without, at minimum, acknowledging those things, but at maximum or ideally weaving those into a thread or into the conversation or into the purpose of what that moment is about, it can leave you feeling pretty uninspired to participate again. And we know that participation is essential for facilitation to be possible. So the idea that you need to value the participation you get, and one of the ways you value that is by demonstrating that you're listening and being present to what is being said by your group. And I fully agree. I think that when we need to honor the participation that is made, at least by acknowledging and engaging with it. I think also, to me, being a good listener as a facilitator means listening beyond the words that are coming out of whoever is sharing. There are words that they're saying, and we can pay attention and listen at that level, right? And we can kind of listen to the content. I often think of it as the content of what they're saying. But I think being a great listener as a facilitator is going beyond that, means listening like at the deeper level. So not just the words that they're saying, but the emotions that they're expressing in their voice, in their tone, in the way, in their facial expressions. I think it's about listening to what they are and are not responding to, both in the question or in somebody else's response. I think listening at those deeper levels is a sign of a great facilitator, where they can say, so I know you just shared this, but I was hearing in your response a level of nervousness or a level of anxiety that was coming up. Can we talk about that? And actually being able to respond to not just the words that are being said, but the how they're being said, the when, and what is and isn't being included. I think those are some marks of a really great facilitator, and allows for so much more information to be made present or mirrored back to the group. And I think as a facilitator, often our job or our role can involve being a mirror and allowing people to see what they can't see or aren't paying attention to themselves. And I think we can do that when we are a really great listener as a facilitator. Okay, let's go on to another question. How do you shift your approach when you're facilitating in person versus virtually? Okay, so the reason I'm smiling is because I'm like, part of me wants to say, you shift everything. And part of me thinks, no, actually, like there's a lot of things that I do similarly. So I would say there is a couple of things that really distinguish to me facilitating in person versus facilitating online. One is the amount of prep that it takes. I think virtual facilitation takes more prep and more intentionality because you have to, nothing is easy to choreograph. You can't just pass out a piece of paper or pass out sticky notes last minute. You have to know what technology you're going to use for those sticky notes, or you have to know what technology you're going to use for that piece of paper if it's more involved than just something you can do in the chat or something like that. So there's a level of kind of leveling up my intentionality and my prep that goes into virtual. So that's one shift in my facilitation, is that I have to think a little more intentionally and plan more intentionally. I also can't just give directions. To me, I need to be able to demonstrate those directions, or rather have them reiterated in the chat or on the slides that are next to me, like being able to do something like this. I need to be able to build some redundancies, because it's not as easy for people to say, I'm sorry, can you repeat that? Or I didn't quite understand that, when they're in their breakout rooms and they're totally separate from the group. So those are a few things to think about that I kind of shift when I am facilitating in person and facilitating virtually. So it's getting a little dark here, so I'm going to get a light and make it a little bit brighter, and then we'll come back and keep on chatting. Okay. Wow, that is so much brighter. Okay. So I'm seeing if there's anything else that I do. Okay, I think the last thing I want to call out for virtual versus in person, other than you have to prepare a little more because you have to know your technology and prep the technology you want to use. You have to, so that's kind of the first thing that we talked about. The second thing that I think is really important is that you have to be a little bit more intentional about managing people's energy and participation. When you're in person, people aren't necessarily going to be able to zone out quite as easily as they are online. When we're online, it is really difficult to not get distracted by all the other things that are going on, right? And to, like, everything is right there for people to be distracted by: their email, their phone, like their favorite website, all of those things. And so I think being intentional about participation and varying the participation and keeping people involved and giving them a good reason to be on Zoom, I think those things become even more important in virtual space. So I often think about, like, how long has it been since I asked everyone to do a thing, to be present, whether that's a live poll, whether that's being in a breakout room, whether that's sharing something in the chat. I think those types of things in person, I think you can get away with a little bit more. There's a little bit more buffer, and there's a little bit more grace in that when people are distracted, maybe they'll look at their phones, but there isn't as much for them to do. And so virtually, I think it's really important to continuously look back to your agenda and think, are there touch points for people's involvement every 10 to 15 minutes at most, so that they never kind of drift off and never have a reason to come back. So that's some of my shifts in approach. All right, let's see. What's the most difficult thing that comes up in facilitation? I am sure that if you ask facilitators this question, they are all going to have different responses. So I will just say one of the most difficult things for me that comes up in facilitation is when I get triggered and I am no longer emotionally available or kind of like fully present for my group. So what I mean by triggered is basically when something happens that just takes over my brain, my body, my emotions, my nervous system, when something just pulls me out of that moment and won't let me go. And a lot of times that can be me getting in my own head about my facilitation. It could be my co-facilitator triggering me. It used to be participants, but for me, it hasn't been that in a long time. But when I am triggered, that is one of the most difficult things to navigate as a facilitator, because I no longer have all of my options available. I find that like when I am not triggered, I am in choice. I am able to make moves. I am able to make intentional decisions about what I want to do next. And when I'm triggered, I react. I don't have all the options available to me, and I am no longer able to really be fully present for my group. And that can be a really dangerous, might be a strong word, but can be a really tricky spot, in the sense that if I have promised my group, like, hey, this is a space where you can explore, where you can ask questions, where nobody's going to make you feel dumb, I can no longer hold that truth or that promise for them when I might be the one at risk of making them feel stupid or making them feel out of place. So I find that to be one of the most difficult things I navigate. I have gotten better and better about it, and I have gotten more practice with it. There's a book that I co-wrote called Unlocking the Magic of Facilitation. And chapter 9 is all about triggers from a facilitator's perspective. And it really goes into Dr. Kathy O'Bear's model of the triggering event cycle and what happens when we get triggered. And then it goes through the model that me and Sam Killerman, my co-author, came up with, which is the triggering events traffic circle, and basically the different strategies that you can use to stop yourself from being triggered. Depending on when you're watching this video, we also have an event where we talk about how to navigate your triggers, and I will either leave a link below or a link below to the event invite, or if that event has already passed, then possibly a link to the recording or more resources around that if you are interested. Okay. That was weird. Okay, so how do you recruit participants when not many people show interest? Yeah, so let's say you've asked for volunteers and not too many folks want to volunteer. My thought is that there's a couple of things. You might have started with too big an ask. So let's say if you're like, hey, I'd love to hear, some of the things that you struggle with as leaders. And I'd love to get a couple stories. Can we get a couple volunteers? And people are like, no, I'm not volunteering in front of this group to tell you that. Then what I would do is I would start with a smaller group size. So I would say, you know what, I think we might have jumped in there too fast. And I want to give us some time to actually think about what comes up for us and give us some time to process before we share with a large group. I think that is probably the move I should have made. So let's do that. And I would start with having them individually think through that question, maybe then move into pair shares or small groups, and then ask, you could do pair shares. You could then have them move into small groups and talk about, what they learned from their partner or some common themes that they came up with. And then when you come back, rather than saying, okay, now I'd like to hear from some individuals about what they're struggling with, I would go with, okay, so what I want to do now is I want to get some common themes from the conversations that came up. What are some things that are just, true within your little small group that we might be able to get into? So what I do there is two things: group size, allowing them to think individually in pairs, small groups before sharing to the large group. The second thing is that when they're sharing in the large group, they're not actually sharing for themselves, they're sharing for their group. And I think that's a really important move to kind of make it a little bit easier for people to talk, because they're not sharing just for their thoughts. They have a collective behind them. And then that idea of putting a little bit of distance between themselves and the answer, where this isn't my answer, right? This is our group's answer. That's really helpful for getting more interest. So that would be one strategy. Another strategy that you might consider is to say, okay, if nobody wants to volunteer, I would love to spend 5 minutes just talking about is there, going into this idea of resistance a little bit. And you might say I'm curious, did you expect to participate in this session? Hands up, yes or no. What are some of the risks that people who are volunteering are stepping into that we can be aware of and conscious of? Basically, going into a little bit of processing or even meta processing the what you're asking of people, and if people are genuinely bought in. That's maybe a more meta way to go about that, but that would be another possibility for How to get people to participate when they don't want to participate. I think another way to sum up that second one is just talk about why they don't want to participate, because in talking about it, you'll be getting them to participate. All right. So, what are methods we can use to encourage quiet participants to speak up without them feeling called out? Well, what's awesome about the online space is that we really can ask people to share in the chat. And they have this method of like sharing verbally without sharing out loud. And that's awesome. And I think we should like allow that to happen, and invite it more. Like, hey, I'd love to hear from some people who haven't shared yet. That'd be my number one tip. It's just saying, I'd love to hear from some people we haven't heard from yet. And then it's not about you being quiet. It's just that you haven't had a chance or taken up the space to step into the group, right? So would love to hear from some people we haven't heard from yet. And if you're up for doing that out loud, that would be awesome. If you're not, I would love you to share in the chat, and then we can read some of your comments out, just to put them into the space. And so those would be the two things that I would go to most immediately to get people to share. And then I also might have them go into pairs or like work in small groups and encourage them to be like, well, we're going to take 1 minute from each person to have them say something. And that way they can have a little bit of sharing in a smaller group, which is a smaller risk opportunity. And maybe that will translate back to the larger group. It is also okay to call people by name and say, you know, we haven't heard from you yet, Susan. Would you like to share? Or like, we haven't heard from you yet, Roberto. Is there anything you'd like to add? And if you say, is there anything you'd like to add? They can just be like, no. And you can say, okay, that's fine. And you can move on while you have done that explicit invite. And as long as you're okay with their no, and you make it clear that they can make a no, then I think it's okay to explicitly invite people by name to share. Okay, a couple more. How do you analyze curriculum or a subject matter to figure out the best way to teach it? So this is a huge question, and I love it. I love big ambitious questions. So I'll try to give you a actually like small and tangible answer to the big and ambitious question. I think that when we think about teaching, facilitating, and lecturing, right, as like 3 ways you might teach or engage a group, I would think of like, what is the information that they really need to know about this subject? Or what is the things that like, that things are kind of hinging on that I can just share directly with this group? Maybe that's something I can lecture. What is something that we can continuously go back and forth on, and we can like their assessment of where they're at can in the moment change what we focus on. So I'll give you an example for that one. I used to teach gender and sexuality, and there are a lot of terms around identity and around gender and sexuality. And so I used to give people a list and say, what I want you to do is I want you to put a star, don't read the definitions, but put a star next to any word you don't know or you're not sure about. And then I would say, okay, let's just go through the list. What's the first star you hit on your page? And somebody would, read out like cisgender. And I'd be like, great. Okay, let's read through that definition and then see if it makes sense and what questions you have afterward. And what's awesome about that back and forth is that we didn't have time to go through the whole list, but I was able to focus on the things they wanted to focus on by allowing them to kind of highlight and star the things we should focus on. So I was looking for like subjects or areas in the curriculum where like their knowledge could change what we focus on right in that moment in kind of like an easy and structured way. And then when it comes to facilitation, I look for things where it is mostly about the opinions, ideas, experiences, voices of people in the room, or where I think we can get a lot of what we need to cover just by asking the right questions. So those are some of the things that I look for when I am teaching a new subject is like, what do people already know about or have a lot of ideas on or a lot of questions? They don't necessarily have to have a lot of ideas if they have a lot of questions that we can focus on, and I can facilitate those sections. What are the things that I know really well that I can share? those are the lecture sections. And then what's that stuff that is really at the heart of like, what do you think? Okay, great. I'll go back and analyze that and adjust my teaching accordingly that we can focus on in teaching. Okay. All right. Still getting a little dark over here. So we'll do a few more. How do you make a topic that is typically lecture and make it more participatory? Okay. So let's see if I can come up with like a formula really briefly. So if you have a lecture and people are showing up for that lecture, and they want to learn about a particular topic, the first thing you can do is ask them why they're there, and you can do that even before they ever arrive. But I would say asking people, what do you want to get out of this? What are the questions you have? Or what drew you to this workshop? Those are all really easy, like intro interaction questions that you can do, where you can have people put a list in the chat. You can have people share out loud, share with a partner, or even do it on a pre-survey and then read it back to the group and summarize some of the things and connect it back to where you're going. So that's the first thing I would do if I was lecturing on a topic to make it a little bit more participatory, is just get a sense of like who is in the room, and or maybe not even who is in the room, but why are you in the room and what do you hope to get out of this topic? So I think you can do that with absolutely any lecture. I think that you could, if you wanted to, in the middle of a lecture, say, okay, so we've covered X, Y, and Z so far. Here's what I'm going to challenge you to do. I'm going to challenge you to turn to the person next to you and tell them one thing that you've learned so far and one question you have so far about the content. So one thing you've learned and one question that you have. And maybe you leave the question just like in their mind to see if it can orient them towards what they're listening to for the rest of the session. Or you could say, okay, with those questions, I want you to write them down on index cards, pass them, I'm doing this an in-person one, pass it to the ends of the rows. And then I'm going to collect those and try to incorporate as many as possible into my Q&A. Or if you're online, you could say, please submit those via an anonymous poll or directly message me in the chat, and I'll try to weave those as much into the anonymous Q&A. Yep. And the last one I'll say is a facilitator card, one of my favorite facilitator cards, which is there is a card called Frequently Asked Questions. And if you have a lecture, I've done this when I was lecturing and keynoting on a topic. I wanted to do a Q&A, but I knew I wasn't going to be able to sort through all the questions. I also knew there was going to be too many people in the audience to actually pull that off and like get questions from the audience. So what I did was I created a numbered list of all the questions or like 8 questions that I knew that they were going to ask, including some that they were going to be afraid to ask, but probably wanted the answers to. And I put it up and I said, which of these questions do you want me to answer? And then somebody would shout out like number 2. And I'd be like, number 2. All right. And we'd read out number 2 and then we would answer it. And that little bit of participation of just letting them direct where the Q&A was going, that made it more participatory and feel more real, even though I had all of the questions prepared already and I had all the answers prepared. So that's just like a little tweak, a little way to make it more participatory. And I think if you're thinking of facilitator cards, you can also use cards that have that individual or pair share aspect without ever having to go into the big group. So if you look for cards that have the individual icon or that have the pairs icon, those cards are something that you could use where you just say, okay, for just a minute, I'm going to have you do this exercise, right, as an individual. And even if you never collect that data or you only have them process that data with one other person, that will really make it feel like they're more engaged and being drawn in than just you lecturing the entire time. Okay. I had a participant who was extremely distressed by a group debrief. They were repeatedly labeled by the group as quiet. Okay, and the rest of this question, which I read offline, was how could I have facilitated in that moment to kind of help that participant who is feeling really distressed by the group debrief and by the labeling specifically, it sounds like. So my thought is that if somebody seems distressed by a label, my brain is going to nonviolent communication, which is that like when we label people versus their behavior, we can often meet resistance and people can often be kind of unsettled by that. And so it sounds like this participant was really unsettled by the idea of being labeled quiet and maybe the judgmentalness that went behind that as well. So what I would say is that as soon as I saw that reaction start to happen, I might say, hey, so I'm hearing people say that this person hasn't shared yet. I wouldn't use the word. I would try to, move towards instead describing what's happened. Like, hey, a lot of people have noted that like Sherry hasn't shared yet. And I don't know, I don't think that calling attention to it the way we're doing it is working for Sherry. Or I want us to, rather than just label Sherry as quiet, I think we need to take a different approach. And so I'm not going to ask Sherry to share right now because I can tell, like subconsciously, because I can tell that Sherry isn't in a place to share, but just saying like, I think we need to be thoughtful about how we're inviting people to share if that's what the action we want, right? And so I want just to call attention to the labeling of an action and maybe the judgment behind that. And instead, I'm just going to invite us to reflect on like if there's a behavior we want, that labeling people is perhaps not the way to go about it. As I'm saying that, that's a pretty long and convoluted way to do it. But I do think this idea of saying, hey, let's not label Sherry as quiet. We have said it's okay to share when you want to, and it's okay to opt out, that we're operating currently under challenge by choice. And it's totally okay that Sherry hasn't shared yet. And just label that as like, that is okay that that's happened. And then maybe check in. And, if you're walking to the next activity or there's a break in the session, to say like, hey, Sherry, is there any particular thing I can do to like, that would help you feel more comfortable sharing with the group? Because I think what people want is for you to share, even if they're expressing that by labeling you. I think what it is they're genuinely interested in wanting to know your ideas. So that might be a strategy that you could consider or tweak to your own liking. All right. Last question for the moment. How does a good facilitator help their participants regulate their emotions if they start yelling or crying? So I think that the first thing that I often lean on is to, especially if somebody's crying, I often validate that what they're feeling is legitimate, right? I might do that in front of the group, or if it's in a setting where it makes sense to do it individually, I will do it individually. But I sometimes just say like, it is totally okay that you're having a lot of emotions come up right now. And I want to thank you for what you've shared, or I just want to like, let you know, like, that's a totally okay response. And to say like, if you or anybody during this time like needs a few minutes to just like to be with those feelings, or to like not take in any more information, this is how I would invite you to do that. If it's online, just would invite you to turn off your camera and take a deep breath, and to like only come back on when you feel like you're ready to be present with more information. Or if you're in person, to say like, it's okay to step out. It's okay to take time to chat with me or with somebody else, just to allow you to like process some of those emotions. That can sometimes be really helpful, and to just give people permission to be where they are. If they're yelling, I would probably try to cut them off pretty aggressively. If they're yelling at me or at other people, I think I would say like, I am going to stop you right there. I think the emotions have gone really high in this moment and at this activity. You might be hearing me raise my voice because I think I would probably have to match their energy a little bit, and say like, the emotions have gotten really high. And it is okay to have big emotions, but what's not okay is to raise your voice in this space. I know for me and for a lot of other people, it is, emotionally dysregulating to have people shouting. And so while it's okay for us to continue to talk about this, if that's true, or if you're like, actually, we're going to move in a new direction now because we need to for time, for the sake of the conversation, or just because like, I don't think this is becoming a productive conversation anymore, I would I personally would require them to lower their voice to at least a place where people weren't kind of like, whoa, like shutting down, that the emotion would be okay, but not necessarily the expression of the emotion. And that would be like my first move, would just be to get them to stop yelling. And then what I would do from there, I think would really depend on how they showed up afterward. If they were like, you know, this isn't okay, like it's okay for me to be angry and it's okay for me to be yelling, I would just say like, it is okay for you to be angry. It is not okay for you to be yelling. And that is like, that's not something that we're going to do in this space because we are bound together as a group right now. You wanting to yell about this topic is legit, but everybody else being bound to listen to you isn't necessarily where I'm going to land. So yeah, so just getting them to agree to not do that. And I think depending on how if they're like, whoa, like you're right, I got really out of bounds there, like let me take that back or let me take it down, I would say, okay, we're going to hear from a couple other people and we can circle back to what you wanted to say, like, but we're just going to take a breather and move into some other folks. So I do think it's important for facilitators to help emotionally regulate their participants when it becomes to a place where their participants are either no longer really able to be present for themselves or they're really disrupting the energy of the group. And that's because for me as a facilitator, I am somebody who really prioritizes and centers my work on the group. And that if an individual is really putting that at risk, I'm going to take actions to try to put that back into a place where most of the group is able to move forward or able to address it, because I think that's important. And I think that that's something that I am established, or like that I can do and prioritize as a facilitator, whereas there might be other people or other places where it doesn't make sense to really put as much onus or responsibility on and as much importance on the kind of regulation of that group space. All right. Okay, well, if you stayed on and watched all the video and of me talking, I super appreciate that. And I hope you got a lot out of this video. Please let me know in the comments below if you have more questions that you would like me to answer at a future video. I plan to do these more regularly, and I would love to answer your questions. Anything related to facilitation is fair game. If you disagree with any of my answers or just have additional thoughts, like maybe you have a yes and or a no or a no but, and either way, I would love to hear that in the comments below as well. And if you are looking for more information about how to learn about facilitation from me and from the Facilitator Cards community, there will be a link below to join our general mailing list and to get some emails for free facilitation resources, but also for events that we are hosting that you might be interested in. So anyway, thank you so much for spending time with me today, learning about facilitation. And until next time, happy facilitating.